Butternut squash is one of the winter squashes, so they're popular in the fall around the holidays. And when you're shopping for one, you want to look for one that has a smaller bulb but feels really heavy for its size. That means it's not full of seeds. I'll show you how to cut that up in just a minute. Today I am doing a butternut squash gratin, which is just an excellent way to use this squash. I'm going to start by caramelizing some onions, so I have some oil in a pan here. This recipe originally called for butter, but I've modified it for an olive oil or an avocado oil, canola oil, whichever you like, because it's on the healthier side because it's unsaturated fat. I'm going to put it in the oil. Now I want these to caramelize, so give it the time it needs to get that rich golden color, and don't do it on too high of a heat because then they'll burn. So you want them to sweat down a little bit and caramelize. Let's talk about the squash. So you got a couple options. You can find the whole squash. You can slice it and dice it to the appropriate size. You can also buy the butternut squash already cut up. The biggest issue with this is sometimes there are little tiny pieces and sometimes there are bigger chunks. So you do want to go through it and make sure you cut up the big chunks to the same size, because that'll affect cooking time. So the topping for this dish is a mixture of fresh ground breadcrumbs, rosemary and thyme, as well as a Gruyere cheese. So I have this lovely chunk of Gruyere that I'm going to grate over here. So the onions are starting to caramelize. They're getting just a little bit golden brown. I am going to add just a hint of sugar to help with that sweetness. And then I'm going to add in the squash, and I've actually got more here than I need for this meal. I'm going to add a little bit of my low sodium vegetable broth and then let this simmer until the squash is almost fork tender. So I'll keep checking it, but I'm just going to add the broth and let this simmer down. And I'm saving a little bit more of that broth to put in the pan when I'm done. So I'm going to pop the lid on, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So I've got my bread here in the blender, and I'm going to go ahead and pulse that and let it turn into crumbs. Beautiful. All right. Then I'm going to take the breadcrumbs and I'm going to mix them with the cheese. This also needs some herbs and spices. So I happen to have some fresh rosemary and thyme here. If you are using dried, you're going to use a little bit more dried than you do fresh, because the fresh is really pungent. So I'm checking the squash and it looks like it's just about ready. There's still a little broth in there, so I'm probably not going to need to use the extra that I had. I do want to make sure it's fork tender though. So I'm going to stick the fork in and it should go in smoothly, come right back out, not meet a lot of resistance. This is good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and dump this in my casserole dish. There we go. Ah, beautiful. Spread that out and then top it with my cheese and crumbs. It's going to go in a hot oven, about 350 degrees, and bake until it's brown, golden brown on top and the cheese is starting to melt. About 15-20 minutes until it's golden brown. So let's try this butternut squash gratin. You can smell the onions. It's just fabulous aroma in here. The cheese and toasty breadcrumbs, and then of course those herbs and spices in there.